Let's start here. So as Saskia mentioned, I'm partner of Studio LA together with Lorien Beijaert. But I wanted to start with this image that is part of an interview with Virgil Abloh, in which he said, "By the time you're on Earth, you're part of a collective, whether you realize that or not." For me, this is the base. This collective exists of a diverse group of people in all sorts of ways. But not everyone in it has the same chances and access. As I'm focused on space, it's clear to me that some people in our collective are allowed to take in more space than others. Some people have more access to spaces, facilities, neighborhoods, countries, and positions than others. Some stories don't deserve as much space as others in our public spaces, buildings, and institutions. As an architect, inseparably connected to space, society, users, I feel responsible for this. I try to be aware of which processes, which stories, which narrations of history I'm part of. What am I supporting and encouraging with my designs? I want to take you along in my positioning as an architect by showing a few personal examples. So I'm born in a country that was called Yugoslavia, now Bosnia-Herzegovina, in this nice, cozy town with people living in it with different religions. When I was a kid, nationalism started appearing, and segregation and later destruction of cultural heritage and ethnic cleansing were part of everyday life. 70% of the city was destroyed by the end of the war. In that time, my family and I fled the country and started out here in the Netherlands. We lived in a refugee center in the middle of the Dutch Bible Belt, but also in the middle of nowhere in an isolated former holiday park. Later, we were allowed to start living in a so-called mixed, but actually segregated, neighborhood in Zoetermeer. When I got older, I started studying here, a place that is shaped by Bauhaus philosophy. And later here, in a 17th century former warehouse and shelter home for the poor. At the same time, I started connecting to my Bosnian cultural heritage, which was mostly destroyed. This all made me quite confused about what to identify with. Did this Dutch cultural heritage, or architecture, or the destroyed buildings in my birth town say something about me? The beauty of architecture is that it can offer us the opportunity to identify with spaces because they are connected to our stories and memories. But we need access in order to access those memories or in order to create them. The neighborhood I grew up in had an architecture without any reference points to Dutch history. And it actually allowed me and my neighbors to exaggerate our own by then mixed identity. Through my neighbors, I learned about different cultures, perspectives, and ways of living. It made me reposition myself and my identity constantly. The architecture forced us to meet each other. You couldn't lose sight of each other. But it wasn't all positive, because on the scale of the city, this neighborhood was isolated from Dutch citizens without a migration background. So by then I realized architecture can facilitate or it can discourage encounters. But how to facilitate them? An example is an ongoing collaboration my studio has with Foundation Discussing You Can Learn. We make space for debate for kids. The base are artworks. And these different artworks are connected to societal themes. The space is designed in a way that kids can see these artworks from different perspectives and discover different truths. At the end, they debate about it in the central and round arena to hear about each other's perspectives. They start understanding each other a bit better. Oh, sorry. When I lived in an asylum center, I was confronted with Dutch traditions. Not aware what kind of tradition this was, my twin brother and I and other refugee kids participated. Later, I became aware of the story that we were celebrating, but also how this tradition was hurting a large group in our collective by holding on to the character of Black Pete. The protests of last weekend showed us that hooligans got space to act aggressively and that the organization Kick Out Black Pete wasn't protected. The moment you see things like this, you cannot unsee it. Our profession touches culture, heritage, stories, access, and also public space. So as architects, we are connected to this. We cannot be blind to this because it touches our profession. This is what has been happening in my family city, Mostar, the last few years. Our public space designs are never neutral. How will people identify with them? Who is given space? In Mostar, where kids with different religious backgrounds live in separated neighborhoods and go to separate schools, there's one shared moment, the ritual of diving off of the old bridge. Because there are hardly any shared spaces for kids, I proposed a diving platform where you can learn how to dive. To study if this works, we organize diving classes for kids. In the local bathhouse, the diving champion teaches them how to dive, but also about the meaning of this ritual. In the Netherlands, with an influx of newcomers, cultural heritage is still going to be one of the challenges. How can we open up, reinterpret, and modify existing cultural heritage so that its meaning becomes more inclusive without silencing painful pages of the past? And we can actually learn a lot from these two people. The last few years, our government decided to house refugees in former prisons, like in the Bijlmerbijes in Amsterdam. 600 residents, 100 children. The interior space was not modified to a livable place. Even the bars were not removed, and the windows were not washed since 1993. Besides doing interior modifications to make the common spaces a bit more comfortable, we took these bars as a symbol for the problem, and we started talking to all organizations that could decide about removing them. Eventually, the organization that houses refugees said they were actually blinds, protecting people from too much sunlight. Our impossible mission we documented in a movie which eventually led to 7 parliamentary questions. Now we are asked to research the architecture of asylum centers in order to give advice to our government how to improve it. By focusing on space within this complex refugee housing issue, we found an entrance that even politicians can identify with: space. For the architects, colleagues, the moment you set foot on Earth, you are part of a collective. Study this collective and its organization. Study its decision makers. Try to be aware of things that are invisible to you. Study your clients and their ambitions. Don't let yourself being led by trends. Don't isolate yourself in your office. Go outside. Study your environment. Go talk to people. The moment you see things, you cannot unsee it. Don't forget you're also part of decision making. Use your skills, your imagination, and visual language to propose things that haven't been taught yet. Thank you.